everybody for coming to this first part of the series. I want to introduce Ava Holiday. She's a researcher, anthropologist, PhD student at
University of Washington.
And she does a lot of wilderness education and kind of trying to figure out how sustainability and social justice connect. And so she's going to talk a little bit about that with us today. So.
Cool. Hello. Thanks for coming. I'm going to put this chair over here. I am just getting over a cold, and so every now and then I just want to sit down. So, as already said, I'm Ava Holiday. I'm a PhD candidate at University of Washington in the Department of Anthropology, and also the founding partner of the Avarna Group, which provides insight and resources for a lot of environmental and educational organizations interested in doing diversity and inclusion and equity work. So that's a little bit about me. Feel free to ask questions as I go through this talk. I'm going to tell you, we're going to go through this talk is really about sort of environmental stories untold and told, and what the consequences of that are, and how that folds into my work. So we'll go from a pretty big picture, and then I'll finally funnel down into what I specifically do. With that said, this is only like 50 minutes, so there's a lot missing. I chose this photo right here, or drawing. It's drawn by a friend of mine, Jose Gonzalez, who's also the founder of Latino Outdoors, and he told me that this photo or this drawing is sort of sprinkling the seeds of culture along with the environmental movement, and that's really a lot of the work that I try and do. So I was like flipping through my Facebook feed and seeing these quotes that Ari was putting up from our conversation. It's always like really nerve-wracking to see yourself quoted, especially as an emerging scholar. And so the quote was, "The very concept of the wilderness is actually the birth of the American environmental movement." And I was thinking about this, and I was like, okay, if I had to make this quote even more perfect, what would I say? Of course, like, I'm always editing myself. So I think that where I want to start is this idea that the concept of the wilderness is actually the birth of mainstream American environmental imagination. So how we think about the environment, and when I say we, I'm really talking about sort of this mainstream environmental movement, how we connect, how advocacy is done, etc. So with that said, I'm going to start with this concept of like, okay, what is wilderness? So from you all, what are words that come to mind when you think of the word wilderness? I'm an experiential educator, so I will ask you to participate in some in this talk, and I will not apologize for it. Any words that come up?
Untrammeled.
Untrammeled, great.
Pristine.
Pristine.
Silent.
Silent.
Danger.
Danger.
Free.
Free.
Beauty.
Peaceful.
Peaceful. Beauty.
Woods.
Woods.
Natural.
Natural. Great. So I ask this question to a lot of different audiences, and I get a lot of the same answers. Some of your answers, peaceful, someone already said that. A respite from industrial worlds, or sort of an escape from the city. It can be scary or dangerous. It's valuable to all people. There's this sort of underlying assumption that it's valuable to all folks. It's beautiful. It's worth protecting or needs protecting or is in danger in some capacity. It's a place where a person is challenged. There are rules and regulations, and that's acceptable. And it needs to be managed. Ecosystems need to be managed. So these are all ideas that are really common. Do any of these sound foreign to you all in the context of the American wilderness? Great, I've done my job. So just hold that, and I will show you a little bit of history as to like why we think of these things and why all of these sort of make sense to us. You may have like individual beef with these concepts, but I think it's safe to say that a lot of the wilderness narrative is wrapped up in a lot of these thoughts. So one more thing that I wanted to tell you before we go forwards is that A scholar, and I am trying to remember who this person is, but I cannot figure it out, said that wilderness is an idea, a geography, and a political process. So today when I'm talking about wilderness, I'm actually really just talking about it as an idea. It's also like an actual place that has boundaries. There are a lot of politics involved. I'm not going to specifically talk about that. So when I'm talking about wilderness today, I'm talking about it as the idea. Great. Okay, so how did we get to all of this stuff right here? So I'm going to tell you 3 different big concepts, and you've probably already heard of them. The first is transcendentalism. So this is a philosophy or a religion, depending on who you're talking to. And the big piece that is pertinent for us today is that for transcendentalists, nature is a place where you can go connect with God. You can become a better person. It is a challenging place, but through that challenge, you find godliness. Transcendentalists were also increasingly concerned with hyper-industrialized urban centers. This is popular in the early to mid 1800s when industrialization was increasing in the U.S. And there's a lot of art and literature around transcendentalism. So this is a painting by Thomas Cole, and I think it embodies a lot of those transcendental ideas. It's a little bit dark and a little bit scary, but at the same time really beautiful. The people, if you can even see them in this painting right there, are really tiny. They're a really small portion. It's expansive. It's peaceful in a way and a little bit scary. So transcendentalism really harkens back to some of this like peaceful, scary, beautiful, challenging, etc. Anyone know who that person is?
Thoreau.
Yeah. Henry David Thoreau. He's a person that you probably hear quoted often. You may not know him by face because he's long been gone. But you often hear a lot of Thoreau quotes in environmental movements, etc. So transcendentalism is one sort of story or concept that is told that still really rings true for a lot of folks who adhere to the wilderness ethic or the wilderness idea. The next one is preservationism. So as people started to access these wild spots, these wild lands, there was a lot of stuff like this happening, like boring a tunnel through a tree. And people like that, anyone know who this is?
Muir.
Yeah, it's Muir. Was like, whoa, this place needs protecting. There were a lot of people that were flooding to these places. To be clear, a lot of people, I mean a lot of people from white and upper middle class communities had the time, had the leisure to go to these spaces and sort of access all of those qualities that transcendentalism said that were available in the wilderness. So preservationism, this idea that wilderness needs to be protected and it should be protected, that there are rules and regulations and that's okay. Preservationism was a really big part of that. The third concept that I want to talk about is conservationism. So this is the idea that our natural resources should be ethically sourced, but there also should still be, we should maintain a balance in our ecology or ecological system. So you get a lot of conservationism happening via the Forest Service, the BLM, and Fish and Wildlife. Anyone know who this is? This is the hard one. Yeah, Pinchot. So this is Gifford Pinchot. He's sort of the father of the conservation ethic, what I just said. So this idea that our wildlands need to be protected, regulated, there should be rules, etc. Conservation is a big part of that. So for those 3, I just want to actually I'll go to the next slide and I'll make this quick note. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that the wilderness concept has heavily influenced a whole bunch of the ways in which we connect to the environment, whether that's land management, legislation, outdoor recreation, environmental advocacy, or many other things. This photo right here, well, I'm having fun quizzing you all. Does anyone know what this is? who this is and what's happening here?
The signing of the Wilderness Act?
Yes, Lyndon Johnson signing the Wilderness Act, and the Wilderness Society was formulated in 1930-something, and had a big part in pushing that forwards. So we went from this idea from transcendentalism and preservationism, and 100 years later, this becomes legislation. Land starts to be federally protected, which is an interesting concept. Did anyone notice anything about all of those concepts and stories that I just told in terms of like the people?
Or white.
Yeah, it's a whole bunch of white dudes. I'm just like being honest. There are certainly people of color and women and people from that hold different identities than white dude that had a part in this. But what I'm trying to tell you is that the stories that are often told are really told about a particular type of person in this history, and that also shapes the type of story that we actually tell. Are there any questions thus far? Cool. You got it. Okay. Stories untold. Someone just said like, oh, this will be fun. And I was like, no, I'm going to talk about colonialism. There's a lot of stories untold in regards to the formulation of the wilderness and more largely the environmental movement. And one of the big ones is colonialism. So I'm going to have you all watch a clip. I realize we didn't test the sound, but we'll hope it works.
Early in 1851, during the frenzy of the California gold rush, an armed group of white men was scouring the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada, searching for Indians, intent on driving them from their homeland. They called themselves the Mariposa Battalion, and late on the afternoon of March 27th, they came to a narrow valley lined by towering granite cliffs, where a series of waterfalls dropped thousands of feet to reach the Merced River on the valley's floor. One of the men, a young doctor named Lafayette Bunnell, stood there, transfixed.
As I looked, a peculiar, exalted sensation seemed to fill my whole being, and I found my eyes in tears with emotion. I said with some enthusiasm, I have here seen the power and glory of a supreme being. The majesty of his handiwork is in that testimony of the rocks.
Bunnell's enchantment with the scenery was not shared by the rest of the Mariposa Battalion, who busied themselves setting fire to any Indian homes they found. Before the battalion moved on, Bunnell convinced the others that, as the first white men ever to enter the valley, they should give it a name. He suggested Yosemite because he thought that was the name of the tribe they had come to dispossess. Later, scholars would learn that the people living in the valley called it Ahwahnee, meaning the place of a gaping mouth, and they called themselves the Ahwahneechee. Yosemite, it was learned, meant something entirely different. In the native language, Yosemite refers to people who should be feared. It means they are killers.
Wow. Okay. I told you this would not be as fun as that could be. So I think that there's two really interesting things happening, and I'll contextualize this clip for you. So one is that none of you had heard the story, and I hadn't heard this story either until I watched this video. And I was feeling a lot of guilt about that, and I was talking to someone about it, and they were like, well, first of all, guilt and shame get you nowhere, true. And these stories are often really buried. I went to look to see if I could find any other sources. It's really hard to find. There's a little bit out there, but this story is not often told. The more sort of interesting thing for me as an anthropologist is that this clip happens within the first 20 minutes of this film. And it's this really nasty history, yet the film is still called National Parks: America's Best Idea. And I think that that's, to me, that is an example of how pervasive and strong that wilderness narrative is in the US, and how we can have a documentary that has this clip that talks about colonialism, and they go on to talk about colonialism in a couple of other contexts as well, but still call it America's Best Idea. That, to me, I think is a really good example of how much, how often we forget to critically think about the wilderness and the creation of the wilderness. This photo here is some Awanichi women who were living in Yosemite. There's a whole bunch of different stories, but this one in particular really gets me every time. There's a whole bunch of stories about colonialism in Glacier National Park and Yellowstone and Yosemite and all across the nation. But these women, a lot of the Awanichi were allowed to stay, but only if they would agree to be basically a living cultural attraction. So people would literally come and walk by and gape at them as they're weaving their baskets. So they're allowed to stay in this land, but their connection to this land and the conditions under which they can be on the land drastically change in service of tourism and in service of some of the wilderness ethic. So there's a lot more colonial stories that I could tell, but I won't. We only have 50 minutes. There's a lot of cultural land use disputes. So we often hear about whether snowmobilers can go to one spot or another, or whether you can mountain bike. That's a really big one that's happening in Washington. And I'm sure it's happening in Montana as well. But an example of a cultural land dispute is this idea of Machu Tapila, or Devil's Tower, which is in Wyoming. This is a sacred place for 20 plus tribes, including the Lakota. And Devil's Tower has been a national monument since 1906. It was the first national monument, so it's under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service. And in recent years, it's become a really popular climbing spot. And but for the Lakota and for a lot of the other indigenous peoples, climbing is something that is not okay to do on this sacred site. So there was a lawsuit in the 90s. The Lakota tried to ban climbing at Devil's Tower for reasons that were backed up by the First Amendment. They lost the lawsuit, but there was a voluntary ban. A lot of people followed it, but this is an ongoing issue. That's more of a living issue and a cultural land dispute. This is also a story that's not often told. How many people had heard of Devil's Tower before? Did you know about the climbing ban?
Yes.
They actually have signage up there talking about it.
It's getting much better. When I've talked, so I also am an outdoor educator and hang out with a lot of climbers. And so often folks don't know about this history. So this is another example of stories untold. There's a whole bunch of examples. There's a great film called I'll Remember and I'll Tell You at the End that talks about a lot of these cultural land disputes. And then there's also a lot of voices, actions, and experiences that aren't talked about. So this black and white photo of this woman here, anyone know who she is? Rachel Carson. Sir, you are getting an A today. So Rachel Carson is actually getting quite a bit more traction these days, but when I first started doing this work about 7 years ago, not a lot of folks know who Rachel Carson was. And there's a big push right now, and we'll talk about it later, about diversity and inclusion in the environmental movement. I think that's part of it. But her contribution to the environmental movement often isn't talked about. That photo of the Chicano Park sign in LA in the 80s and 90s, and still happening today, there is a huge environmental movement being led by Latino folks to get more urban and green spaces, and that's just an example of what they do, but often those stories aren't told. It's not seen as part of the environmental movement because it's so hyper-urbanized, But it really is. It's getting folks outside. And then this right here, there's a book by Carolyn Finney, Black Faces, White Spaces, and she talks about a couple of different things. One is she talks about how her parents were never marked as environmentalists, but they were stewards of some land for nearly all of their lives. And even her own parents were like, oh, we're not really environmentalists, we just take care of this land. And it's sort of like, oh, there's some tension there. She also talks about the experience of African Americans in the outdoors, particularly there were a lot of lynchings that happened in the woods. And so for a lot of Black families, the woods was not a safe place. It was not peaceful. It was not an okay place to be because that's where a lot of violence happened. So a lot of these stories are not often told, or not told as often. Any questions? Cool. Okay, like, so who cares? I get this question asked actually quite a bit. It's like kind of surprising. So the myriad of both positive and negative experiences that are ignored or not talked about as often contribute to mainstream environmentalism having a pretty myopic or narrow understanding of how people even connect to land and why they might be connecting to land, why they might be accessing it in a particular way. To be a little bit more uplifting, there's a whole bunch of people that are doing grassroots work to change this. So Venture Out is a program specifically towards getting the queer community outside. They're based out on the East Coast and creating affirming spaces for anyone who identifies as queer. Outdoor Afro is trying to bust the stereotype that Black people don't go camping or Black people don't go hiking, and trying to get a lot of Black families outside and getting them to tell their stories via social media, etc. Latino Outdoors does a lot of the same stuff that Outdoor Afro does. Jose Gonzalez, the person who drew the painting at the front of this PowerPoint, is the director of this, but he really sees himself as building a network of people who identify as Latino or Chicano and also are environmentalists or interested in the outdoors. Colors of Nature is just a really great book. A lot of environmental literature happens to be from a lot of like dead white dudes. This is a lot of folks of color writing about nature and their experiences in nature. I already mentioned Carolyn Finney's book, Black Faces, White Spaces. And then Out There Adventures are some folks that I know pretty personally that do outdoor education specifically for queer youth up in Seattle. And they're trying to, again, create affirming spaces for queer youth. So, I'm afraid if I hit it too many times, it's going to like rush through. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my work argues that environmentalism needs to have a social justice lens embedded or mapped on top of it for it to be really successful. And to be clear, you can do it. There's already a movement that's doing this. It's called environmental justice. I'm guessing that a lot of you already know what environmental justice is. But this movement really started in the 80s and 90s when people in historically marginalized communities were starting to get really outraged about the fact that they were bearing the brunt of a lot of environmental issues. So pollution, air quality, water quality are probably like the three big ones. All of that disproportionately impacts communities of color or low-income communities. And so there were some people that were like, not okay. Bob Bullard is probably like the father of environmental justice. These are just some photos. I'm like a big visual learner of people doing environmental justice work, whether it's through marches. I think Free This Land and Decolonize is actually from Idle No More, which is mostly up in Canada, but has sort of come down to the U.S. This again is by Jose Gonzalez, Basta Means Enough. Ain't No Love in the Cities. and then My Neighborhood is Killing Me. So these are campaigns or pieces of art from environmental justice groups that are saying our communities are disproportionately impacted with air pollution or air quality, water quality, etc. So these people are already mapping social justice on top of environmentalism, but it's really urban focused. One thing that I think is really cool about Montana is that there's actually some environmental justice work that's mapped on top of wilderness work. I'm sure that you all have talked about or have heard about what's going on in the Two Medicine Badger or Badger Two Medicine Wilderness. I can never remember which one. And they're doing some really interesting work. I wanted to copy their mission statement here because they are talking about how this place is both culturally and ecologically irreplaceable. So they're also mapping this idea of like social identity, cultural identity, onto this idea that this is also a really important environmental space. I don't have any personal experience with them, but their mission statement really sings to me. Okay, but what about mainstream environmentalism? Because a lot of these groups are not going away. How are they mapping social issues on top of environmental issues? This is sort of more the heart of my research. So I was just at a meeting with these four, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, the Audubon, and the Wilderness Society, and a couple of other organizations that are working on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's really how they are approaching trying to put more of a social justice lens into their environmental work. Some of them are focused more on creating a more inclusive workspace, which will foster a more diverse workspace to get more people's ideas and experiences and connections to land in the actual workforce, which would hopefully then their idea translate into their policies. Other organizations are trying to make it so their actual policies and their sort of externally focused work, their policy work, is more inclusive of different ways that people connect to land. And some of them are doing the same. So like the Sierra Club, for example, has the Sierra Outdoors Outing Club, and they're trying to make sure that their volunteers are, for example, not like microaggressing the people who are coming on these courses. So that's what mainstream environmentalism is sort of up to these days. And what's really at the heart of my work is I do research on outdoor education. So there's two observations that this work is based off of. One is that outdoor education relies on wilderness as a teaching space, as a good teaching space, and often assumes that wilderness is for everyone. Hopefully the past half hour has shown you that like wilderness isn't necessarily for everyone. There are different ways people can connect to land. And I specifically do work at the National Outdoor Leadership School. And these are two of their two photos from their catalog, which sort of shows some of what I'm talking about. Nature is a great teacher, so this sort of assumption that like, yes, nature will teach you things. And then the Knowles experience right here, it says find yourself here. This idea that you can sort of insert anyone, any body into this place and they'll have this positive Knowles experience. That doesn't actually happen, and they know that. And I work with them to sort of figure out how to make their courses more inclusive. Nevertheless, they're still sort of working within this tension of like, okay, we want the Knowles experience to be for everyone, but maybe it's not. So the second observation, so outdoor organizations are actually starting to recognize that they're really homogenous spaces. And so they've instituted a lot of diversity and inclusion efforts. Some of them are more successful than others. This photo right here is a photo of the Expedition Denali team, which was the first African-American summit bid on Denali. That was sponsored by Knowles and a couple of other, I think like the North Face sponsored it. So that's one example of a diversity and inclusion effort sponsored by Knowles. So those are the two observations. And then I wanted to share this quote with you you don't have to read it, I will read it to you. But this comes from a person who is also working in outdoor education that happens to be an Outward Bound course. And this sort of shows how diversity and inclusion efforts can create some sort of tension if outdoor education organizations don't think critically about what their organization is all about. So this quote comes from an instructor, and he was giving folks a long speech. They had just finished a 30-day mountaineering course. He was talking about how amazing they had all done, that they'd performed amazingly, and he was so excited for folks to come back because they now had this new set of skills to go mountaineering and backpacking, etc. So the instructor, Jeff Rose, says, "I was certain these were important lifelong skills everyone should have. After my extended monologue, I felt sure the conversation was over. But this time it wasn't. The participant persisted. See, Jeff, I don't think you understand. This isn't what I do. This is your thing. Why would I want to do this? Why would I want to do stuff like this? Why would I want to come out here and sleep on the ground if I don't have to? Why would I scare myself on some ridiculous rock climb up a mountain in the middle of nowhere? Why would I work so hard to find water and to fix my dinner every night? I get that every day at home and I hate it. I work hard to avoid those things, not to look for them. So why would I do that out here if I don't have to?" So one thing that I forgot to tell you before reading this quote is this was all the students that were on this course were a product of diversity and inclusion outreach. So these were students of color, students that came from low-income backgrounds that didn't have a lot of experience, and for this person didn't have a whole lot of desire to be out there. So this is an example of diversity, where some of that friction is, and why outdoor education organizations aren't immediately successful once they start implementing diversity and inclusion efforts. I'm going to come back to this slide. So the big question that I am investigating and that lots of organizations are trying to answer is that, will outdoor education programs let go of at least some of this wilderness ethic, holding on to this idea that mountaineering or backpacking or rock climbing is an overwhelmingly positive experience for all students? Will they let go of some of that in service of creating spaces for all environmental experiences to be heard? Or are they too attached to that wilderness ethic and those long expeditions where you can sort of hark back to those transcendental ideas of like self-discovery, not necessarily becoming closer to God, but like resilience, experiencing beauty, etc. So that's sort of the big question that's looming over Knowles and looms over a lot of my research. So I have this up here just because these are organizations that are implementing some sort of diversity and inclusion effort in outdoor education, and they're all doing it in really different ways, and I want to just briefly talk about the different ways that people are doing that. So the Bold and Gold program, which I have worked for, specifically wants to create multicultural leaders for a better environmental future, I think is the mission. And so they try and recruit a highly diverse student population and try and recruit a highly diverse instructor population. Both of those things are really challenging because they're still pretty attached to the wilderness ethic. And for some people, they don't feel like they can be away from home for that long. Some students, some of the friction that we get in recruitment is like, I can't leave my siblings because I take care of them. Like that's something that's often not thought about. Nevertheless, they have a really thoughtful curriculum, I think. Knowles is trying to increase the diversity in terms of the student population they have, and they're running up against some of the same issues of like students being like, well, it's just like isn't my thing. You're not allowing my environmental experience or just my life experience to be part of this course. So they're working really hard to change that. They're also working hard to try and get a more diverse instructor population with some results. Outward Bound is so franchised out, I actually sometimes don't know how to talk about them, but they have some sort of more, what I think they call like city programs, which is sometimes like a euphemism for the diversity and inclusion effort. I don't really know. I like specifically did not pick this as a field site because it was too confusing. but they are doing some work, and I know a lot of Outward Bound instructors that are really great people. Out There Adventures, as I said before, is really based, and I should have put the Venture Out project up here too, trying to get queer adults and queer youth out into the woods, and having a more affirming experience. There are a lot of stories, particularly of trans people being outside and it being a pretty horrifying experience for various reasons. The Adventure Risk Challenge actually tries to map on literacy and wilderness programs onto each other, and that seems to be really successful because there's some skills training involved in it, and they get to do that skills training in a place that is not in the classroom, and for some students that's really awesome, and that works really well for them. So those are different programs that are trying to do this work. Okay, so I sort of like promised her, I was like, what can you do? Because sometimes this is a really depressing talk. Someone once told me that like as you get deeper into your anthropology career, you're gonna like continue to bum people out more and more. It's like super true. So I like to think about this work in a couple of different ways. One is like that external work that you put out into the world, and then the work that you do on yourself. So first up, the external work. Support grassroots environmental organizations. This may look different for different people. Like me, as a white woman, I can support grassroots organizations really differently than, for example, my business partner who's a woman of color. So that may be like attending their fundraiser, or it may be actually doing work and work with them and doing, I don't know, actual like on the ground service stuff. It all, all organizations also do different work. If you support mainstream environmental organizations, which I think is like a great thing to do, encourage them to implement a diversity and inclusion plan. And there are many different ways that they can do this. There are lots of different resources out there. And also, I think this is the big one, encourage mutually beneficial partnership with local communities. Like this idea of mutually beneficial partnership, I shouldn't have to say mutually beneficial, but so often there are partnerships that are forged that are really one way. And that's been a really common complaint of folks that are doing this work in sort of more of a grassroots way. And then if you are an educator or a program manager, incorporating local land history into your programs or your curriculum can be really powerful. Young people are super smart, and if they have this information that's like so often buried, they might surprise you and do really wonderful things with it. The internal work, read up on environmental history if you have the time in your life to read. I know that sometimes people hand me books and I'm like, wow, next year. But if you do have the ability to sit down and read or just learn, make sure you're learning from a diverse group of writers and thinkers. My contact information is on the next slide. If you have questions, like please feel free to email me. I think that's really important. If you're an educator or a guide or doing direct service, making sure that your students, clients, participants, whatever you call them, are able to bring their own experience into the environment, into the outdoors. So often in outdoor education, students will come back from a course and we're like, did you not have an awesome time? And like, what happens if they say no? Right? They're like, no? Or sometimes they're like, yeah. And you just like shut down the conversation. I have like come up with all sorts of tactics. I like to ask people like, what was your most challenging day? What did you learn? Did you have fun? Did you have fun? I'm not going to assume that you had fun. You learn a lot, especially from young people who are like, oh, okay. So making sure that people can bring in their own experience. There's also a lot of expressive activities that you can do on course or in your programs that allow people to bring themselves to the work. And then also just recognizing your own assumptions about the environment and the wilderness. I grew up loving the wilderness. I still do. I go climbing, I go backcountry skiing. but I also now have a new lens in which I understand where I am coming from, and it makes it so much easier to have conversations with people and learn from people that are really different from me, or just slightly different from me. That's it. One thing that I want to tell you is that I was just telling Ro this, I am in the midst of building out an online resource tool that's totally free. It's a searchable database for resources about reading, assessment, activities, etc., all around this work. The website is theavarnagroup.com, and it's under the resources tab. It should be built out in the next week, I'm really hoping. So feel free to access that. Like, it is there for you all if you want it. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Those are 2 good emails. I have like 4 others that are also good. That's like how it goes these days. But yeah, any questions that you all have? Yeah. All right.
Yeah. I was wondering what kind of things you say to validate, like, not so positive experiences with wilderness, or for people who kind of like enjoy themselves, but they don't see it as their thing. Like, how do you respond to that kind of reaction?
So I feel like you're asking me actually 2 different questions. One is, how would I react if someone was like, this just isn't my thing? Mm-hmm. And then also, how would I react to like a student that I had? Mm-hmm. Like, am I right?
I guess as someone who like doesn't have the same kind of transcendental or enthusiastic experience or outlook toward the wilderness.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that like, I often would say, like, that's totally fine, great. Like, if I'm just trying to get to know someone, I'm like, then like, what do you do in your spare time? If I want to have a conversation about like why environmentalism might be important to them, I might bring it back to be like, where do you live? And start talking about how the environment and environmentalism, it's not just like that wilderness thing over there. I might try and engage that person through their own life experience, but I have to know so much more about them. So much of this work is building rapport with people. And building rapport, you end up learning a ton about them, and then that conversation becomes really easy. So if I have students on course that are like, this just is not for me, I'm like, I hear you. I appreciate that you came out here and you gave it a try. We have X amount of days. What can we do to support you in your learning objectives? Because people can not have a good time and also learn stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, it's a bummer, but and like me, they'll probably never come back, and that's totally fine. But they still can learn. And so, like, there's a difference between them not having a good time and them feeling unsafe. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, great. Any others? Yeah.
You know, I grew up in a wilderness area, and then I wound up going to the city for an education. And so I've spent a great deal of time, and I'm much older than all of you, except perhaps for this woman. And one of the things that appalled me in urban areas was the lack of connectedness between young people who lived in the city and the environment that supports them, and a lack of educational emphasis, even though the environmental movement is huge and large, but a lack of educational emphasis that actually teaches kids that what you have comes from there, okay? So you have to respect the tree, the dirt, the cactus, the iguana, whatever. What you have now in the city will not be available to you unless you understand what's outside your boundaries, what's outside the city limits. And I think there really needs to be some kind of educational thrust that will enable people, enable students to internalize that. And I don't know, you know, I don't have kids. I actually have a personal problem that relates to social justice in the environment that has inhibited my participation in sessions like this. But it's a cause that's really important to me, just as it was important to Rachel Carson. And I don't understand how in all these years, all these decades, it still is not important enough to be well taught.
Yeah, I hear you. So I think that like on one end there's an institutional issue, which there's really a separation between the wild and the city or civilization, and that's something that scholars write about all the time, but doesn't really get translated. I do think that in hyper-urbanized areas like New York City, Seattle, Washington, San Francisco, there actually is a movement to sort of bring this idea of growing your own food, at least, and like knowing where all that stuff comes from. There's some really interesting programs. And one other thing that I wanted to add that I think is really interesting, that I'm sort of channeling what my friend Jose Gonzalez might say, or my advisor Devin Pena might say, that in particular the Latino community actually has a really deep connection, because a lot of the times there are large families that are growing vegetables in their backyard because that's the most economically sustainable thing to do. There's actually a person at University of Washington right now doing research on the Latino community in San Jose there are all these community gardens that are in people's backyards. So there's no like visibility. So I think that there's sort of an interesting tension that like, yes, and I think that there are certain communities that are actually doing this work. They are just not marking it necessarily as environmentalism or food justice or environmental justice. So yeah, that is sort of, those are my thoughts on that.
See, I think it needs to become an integral part of the public education system.
Yeah, and that is
Somehow.
certainly missing. It's happening in Berkeley, California, of course.
Well, I'm
But
from
they're doing-
California, and I make no apologies.
It's okay, I grew up in California too. I feel like a little bit of an imposter here in Montana.
It just seems to me that it's something that seriously needs to be done.
I hear you. I mean, I'm with you, and I.
You know, the hands-on approach is wonderful, except that I'm kind of. It's how do you foster that love? You know, you said that you have students who say, well, it's not my thing. How do you foster in an urban environment love of wilderness?
So I would disagree with you on that. They don't have to have a love of wilderness. They need to have some sort of meaningful connection to the environment. And that doesn't have to be the wilderness. So a student can, or a person.
I'm sorry I misspoke.
Okay.
I should have said environment. Forgive me.
So yeah, I think that is really important. There are so many different ways that that's happening, and I think that sometimes we don't recognize the ways in which that's happening, because there actually are a lot of people that are doing that work, but it's not marked as environmentalism, which is like, and part of that tension that like there's this really myopic, narrow understanding of like what environmentalism is. But I appreciate your comments, and I think that it would be really wonderful if the public school system would institutionalize some more interesting curriculum, not just around environmentalism, but like also history. Like the way in which I learned about America's history was like pretty uninformative. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Ava, I wonder if you would please elaborate a little bit on your comment about how you could work with the Sierra Club, but not your partner, who is a person of color.
We would work
And
differently.
You skimmed over that, and
Yeah.
I was like, wait a second, I'm not sure I really understand.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. So we would work differently. So part of the reason that we partnered together is because we realized that there are some things that I can say as a white woman that don't go over as well when a woman or even a person of color says it. So I can more easily go into institutions that are historically white and be like, y'all need to figure out what's happening with your white privilege, and talk about that journey. I've experienced some of, like we're all on a journey, it's never ending. But I've been doing that work for a while. versus my business partner can say that, but it may not hold as much weight. Similarly, I really respect the work, for example, that Outdoor Afro is doing, but I'm never going to be like their community leader because I have no idea what it's like to be a Black person. Just don't. So I like to support them from afar if I can do anything. That's really wonderful, but I'm never going to be a leader in that group, and that's totally fine. So that's what I sort of mean by doing that work differently.
Thank you.
Yeah. Ari, did you have?
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna ask, so when you say, like, not necessarily a love for the wilderness is required, but a meaningful relationship with the environment, are you talking about, I don't know, the first thing that came to mind is that in my hometown, also in California, there's a thing that's going on called Africa Town where people are planting a community garden, and it's a way, and it's partly sort of marketed or like, you know, expressed as environmentalism, but also part of it is like minority communities taking back their community and saying, you know, this empty lot was an empty lot for a really long time, but it could actually be used to benefit its own community there. And so is that like what you're talking about, where it's like people in that community can be doing that sort of work and it's environmentalism?
Yeah.
But they don't have to like go to Yosemite.
Exactly.
Love it. Okay.
Yeah, and I also think that the point that you're making is like, yeah, it's like they're doing environmental work, but they're also doing like community building. Mm-hmm. And so this idea that environmentalism and environmental work can just be in a silo by itself, I think is not helpful, and if in some ways destructive. So moving towards a more environmentally and socially just future. Just, you know, just minutes away.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you have any information on like policies or more systemic things that have been put in place to kind of get at. It seems like accessing the environment is such a privilege, and you know, even just to go on a backpacking trip, like a tent, a backpack, everything's so expensive. Has there been any like bigger policies or things put in place, like with the Forest Service or the national parks, or?
So the Forest Service and National Park both have some programs to get particularly youth of color outdoors, and there's a couple of there's an organization called Youth Outside that gives people job skills so they can become outdoor educators, and in that process you have access to the outdoors. There's also, I was just participating in a summit for the Outdoors Empowered Network, and this is a consortium of organizations that have gear libraries and provide trainings for people who are already doing education work. So like if a teacher in the school system is like, I really want to take a group of students out backpacking, but I don't really know how to do that, they can go to one of these, the first one is called the Bay Area Wilderness Training Center. They can go to BOT and say like, hey, can I get a training, and also can I borrow some of your gear? They have this huge gear library. So there are some places that are doing that work. There's one in Idaho that's just starting up. So if like, that's probably the closest one to Missoula. But if you want to support them, like, please do. That's a great way to support a grassroots organization. So those are two ways that I can think of immediately of trying to get folks out there. There's also tons of scholarships. But it's been found that often money is not the barrier, it's the conditions in which students enter into that. They're like, I just don't want to be away from my family for that long, or they really can't, or there's like, I just don't want to be the like only person of color, or like I don't want to be the only queer person in this space for 30 days. That sounds exhausting. Great. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon talking or listening to me. Please contact me if you have any questions. Thanks.
Thank you.